Welcome everyone to our episode 104 of our podcast, David Ortega's B. And we are going to talk about healing from trauma, 3 words to empower your voice with Jackie Bailey, who is an honor guest. Thank you, Jackie, for accepting the invitation to the podcast. And I'm going to introduce her. So, Jackie is started with a question or let alone a sentence. Don't tell anyone. Silenced Jackie Bailey at the age of 8. 15 years later, she saved another child by speaking up, known as the International Conversation Coach. Jackie inspires clients to break their silence and become victorious over trauma. Today, she is the founder and executive director of the Speak, Feed, Lead project, which has empowered hundreds of children, teens, and adults with confident, courageous voices shared on global stages, competitions, podcasts, and books. Jackie is a 2015 semifinalist in the World Championship of Public Speaking and a TEDx speaker, and you can learn more of her at https jackiebailey360.com. And we're going to post the links after the episode in the comments in the description. Thank you, Jackie, for being here.
Thank you, David. I'm so honored to be here.
And my first question that I have is, well, question and curiosity, of course, is how did you arrive to this powerful message of uh, helping people speak?
Well, like many people I've learned from, they come through something tragic or challenging, and that teaches them a solution or an answer to a problem, and now they can inspire other people with their stories. And I am no different in that regard. I grew up in an abusive household, and it happened chronically from early childhood all the way through adolescence. And I was told not to tell. I was taught to lie. And it really changed who I was or who I could have been because it made me fearful of speaking up. I was afraid I might accidentally tell something that I shouldn't. And so I never really initiated conversation. I was uncomfortable in social situations and settings with friends. And so most people might have called me or defined me as a shy child, but I don't think I was shy. I just was careful in what I would say. And it wasn't until I was faced with a real crisis when I was married and I had two of my own children when that chronic abuser of mine had a child of his own, and it happened to be a girl. He had a baby girl.
Mm.
And I was faced with this decision of, should I speak up to say something so that she doesn't have to be in danger?
Mhm.
Or should I just stay quiet because I had a lot to risk? I didn't know if once people knew how really ugly I felt or was inside, that would my husband still want to be married to me? Would they think I'm crazy and take my kids from me? All of those thoughts started to circle through my mind, and I actually considered suicide as a way that I wouldn't have to think about this anymore or worry about it anymore. But when it came down to it, I realized if I was the only one who knew this danger and I left the planet without telling anybody, then would my own kids be in danger?
Mm.
And so I decided to break the silence, and I started by telling my husband why I had been so miserable for months and months at a time since that baby had been born. And he didn't leave me. Was actually very supportive. And I started breaking the silence to more and more people. And I just realized little by little how very important it was for me to be heard.
Mhm.
And I did save the life of this little girl. She was actually a niece of mine because my abuser was an older brother. And so
Mhm.
I saved her life and made people aware of the danger she was in, and she was protected from then on. So it did matter, even though it was very, very hard to do. it mattered, and I was worthy of being heard. And so today I have this business where I teach public speaking skills to
Mhm.
children and to young adults because I never want them to feel silenced, even if they are in an abusive situation and perhaps they don't feel comfortable breaking the silence of their abuse. I want them to have opportunity to speak out about things that they do want to talk about, things that they feel free to talk about, and not silence them in other ways. And I feel like by doing that, if they have trauma to talk about or abuse to report, they'll be more confident to do so because they've been able to nourish their voice and gain confidence to do that. So that's why I do what I do.
Well, it is extremely powerful what you mentioned, and I also can imagine that it was really, really complicated to deal with those emotions of not not knowing how people was going to react to you when such um, permissive message was going to be shared. And my first question that comes to mind is what kind of symptoms and feelings did you have when you were not able to speak? I think
Mm.
this is important to highlight for people so that they can recognize that not saying the things that you need to say and saving them up eventually will come out in your health, and you will start to have certain things that will appear in your life and your body, of course. So what can you tell the people that don't say what they need to say? How do they recognize, or what were your symptoms?
That's a wonderful question, David. And you're right. Whenever we hold emotions inside, it does begin to affect us physically. And as far as feelings I had when I was young,
Mhm.
um, I felt very alone. There was really no one that I could break the silence to, even if I knew the words to use to describe what was happening to me. There was just no one to tell. My parents were very unhappy in their marriage. They were arguing a lot, and in fact, by the time I was 11, they were divorced. Both of them remarried, and even though I had a stepmother and a stepfather, I was just limited to the closeness that I could have with them because of circumstances. And so one of the first things I remember is just being alone and not having anyone that I felt really cared about me. And then on another occasion, I felt it was my responsibility to hide what I was feeling because I didn't want to make anybody else feel bad. In fact,
Mm.
one abuser, there were multiple abusers in my life, but one abuser was a family friend. It was a friend of my parents. And he would come to the house when he knew my parents weren't home.
Mm.
And he would take me into a separate room and, do his thing. And I remember my mother reading a headline in the newspaper to me one morning. I was probably 11 years old or so. And she read this headline. She said, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe Ray has been arrested for molesting his daughters. Wow, I'm so glad he never did that to you, Jackie." She never asked me if he had done it to me. She assumed that he hadn't, and by the fact that she said, "I'm glad he never did that to you," made me feel like I could not break my mother's gladness. If I were to say something to her about that happening to me, then she wouldn't be happy any longer. And so that was this another level of pressure put on me to just keep it quiet. And then on another occasion, several years later, so I was about 14 or so at the time, my mother, she must have sensed that I was at ill peace about something, right? She
Mhm.
came into my bedroom one night and she sat on the edge of my bed and she said, "Jackie, are you letting someone do something to you they shouldn't be?"
Mhm.
And the way she asked that question, "Are you letting?"
Yeah.
confirmed to me that I was at fault for this. I was letting it happen. What a horrible person I was for letting this happen. And so, again, I remained silent because now the guilt piles on, right? So you've got loneliness and you've got this pressure to not make anyone else unhappy. And now there's this guilt and shame because that's how you start to feel that you are a horrible person, because somehow you have control over this and you're not stopping it. So you must like it. And boy, that would make you awful. So those are some of the feelings that I do remember having. But there was always this little voice inside of me, inside of my head, that would say, if you live through this, you're going to be really strong.
Hmm.
And I don't know what that meant, but it was something that kept me going. And I just learned to manage the pain that I was having, learned to manage those things. Well, now the physical side of it, by the time I was a young woman, I must have been only maybe 21 or 22 years old. And I started having painful joints. Just every joint of my body would hurt for different reasons, or they'd get swollen. And well, I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia in my early 20s, and that was before it was really even a well-known term. But there wasn't any medication for it. There was really no treatment for it at that time. I'm not even sure if there's treatment for it today. But I was just told that I needed to really keep my muscles in tone so that, if my muscles were in tone, then my joints would be stronger and everything. So that was just something that I took to heart, and I did. But then I also developed some other autoimmune problems as well. So I had endometriosis after I'd had a couple of children, and I had trouble getting pregnant after that. And then I developed Hashimoto's disease, which is a hypothyroid condition. And I attribute all of those conditions to the unhealthy emotions I had inside, and that it just started to affect me in different ways. And so it is something that you feel like you can manage, maybe the emotional side of it, but you don't really know the damage that it's doing to you physically, and perhaps you won't know until later on. And sometimes it's hard to put those two, to connect them together. But I find that in most cases with trauma survivors, the physical part is always associated with the trauma.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for explaining the symptoms and the diseases, because and I ask that question because many people that probably don't think that someone did something to them and it was an abuse. Probably the first reaction is, well, I don't know if it was really an abuse. So it's neglecting the things, no?
Right.
And then when they swallow everything and they don't want to say things because of the opinion of others or the reaction of others or the rejection of others, is what you are doing in your body is rejecting yourself. And any autoimmune disease is a rejection of the body towards itself, towards the cells, towards everything. And the inflammation is also a reaction that it is produced because of those things. So we don't recognize that our mind and our body are connected, and they will express in a way, and they will signal to you that you need to do something. And that is also extremely important to recognize for any kind of people that needs to say something, whether they think it is not an abuse, let's say, or they don't, because sometimes, mostly when you are a child, it is very difficult to know, to recognize. And as you mentioned, people that perform abuse usually have a position of trust in the family, of trust in the social sphere, and that's the first abuse that they do. They gain the trust of people so that they can do whatever they want to do. And so, what do you think it was the breaking point of? Well, the breaking point you mentioned in the story that it was when your brother have a child, and it
Mm,
was a girl.
yeah.
But what were the also the body signals that you recognized that told you and that made you have the courage to speak up?
Yeah, well, that I quickly went into crisis mode, and so I had two little kids at that time too. My daughter was probably close to 3, and then I had a baby. My son was a baby at that point when this niece was born, and I all of the emotions over my entire childhood came back
Mm,
in just one moment, and I was just overwhelmed with all different sorts of feelings. And when it all sort of settled, it just became anger. And I became really short-tempered
mm,
and angry all the time. If my 3-year-old daughter, stepped in front of the TV while I was trying to watch something, I would just fly off the handle and smack her on the diaper, on her rear end with the diaper on it. And it was like my husband started to notice this something weird is going on because this is not who Jackie is, you know. But that's what started to come out of me is I was acting out, lashing out, literally hitting and getting angry because I didn't know what to do with all of these emotions that were erupting at the same time for me. So it was definitely crisis, and I went inward. I didn't want to socialize with anybody. I don't think I went into depression, but I was definitely withdrawn from everything good in life. I just did not know what to do, and I was facing this situation where it was all up to me. It was all up to me. There was no one else I could you can even tell or talk to about it, and so I had to make this decision. But like I said, what finally came out to me is I needed to love my children more than I hated myself. And by loving my children, that meant I needed to make sure that they were safe. So even if I decided to commit suicide, I needed to let people know that my niece and my children were in danger. Um, and so when I told my husband about it, like I said, he was just very supportive. And then once I had someone that believed me, it became a little bit easier to start telling other people about it. And then I started therapy, which I recommend, but you have to find the right therapist. I saw one therapist, and in the first 10 minutes, I knew she wasn't right for me. I just knew it. But I found another therapist. She, on the very first day I met her, she asked me a question that I thought might just seal the deal that I'm not going to see her either, but I realized she was right. So one of the first questions after sharing the story of what I'd gone through with her, and I really it was very emotionally hard to get it all out. She asked me, "Can you forgive?" And
yeah.
I just about laughed. Like, are you kidding? Because it almost seemed like she was asking me to do something near impossible, like, pick up a big truck and, throw it across the road. I mean, it just seemed that impossible in that moment to forgive. And yet then she said to me, well, if you aren't working toward that possibility, you will never fully heal.
Mm,
And she said, you don't have to forgive tomorrow. You don't have to do it in 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 years. You don't have to do it before you die. You don't have to do it at all. You just have to be working toward possibly being able to do that. And so that at least became less of a burden and more of a goal. And I also started to realize maybe that voice that was always in my head saying, if you live through this, you're going to be strong. Maybe that's what that strength was coming from. Maybe it was the strength to be able to forgive. That was what that meant. And so if I could someday forgive, wow, that would be huge. And so I didn't necessarily focus on the forgiveness part of it, but I just worked a little bit at a time to start healing. And one of the big things I did during those early days is my therapist encouraged me to write a letter to my brother and just spell out everything that he had done, everything, the ways it made me feel, how it affects me now and every day at that point. And so I did that. And then I read it to her. And she said, "Okay, now I want you to either mail it to him. You can burn it. You can tear it up if you want to. You could even read it to him in person, just like you did to me today," she said. Because the choice is yours. But now that it's all on paper, if you want to just throw it away, that's going to be a big step in healing. And I decided that I'd read it to him, that I would schedule a time to sit with him in person and read it to him. And she encouraged me to have a friend there, just for support, so that I wasn't alone with him or anything like that. And so I did that, and a friend and a neighbor. I just said, "I just need you to sit. I just need you to sit with me. I don't need you to say anything or do anything. I just need you there." And so I did. And so I read this letter to him.
Yeah.
That was huge. That is something, when she first asked me to do that, I thought I could never possibly do, because I was still feeling all the shame, right? And it was just going to bring out that ugliness even more. But I decided, if that's what it's going to take, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. And what was revealed at that time, David, which it surprised me, because my brother said that he'd sought for help when he was a teenager, that he went to 3 different authority figures outside of our parents and told them what he was doing to me.
Oh.
And you know what? Nobody helped him, and nobody helped me. No one ever came to me and asked me about anything, or tried to open a conversation. So I felt this little bit of compassion for him at that moment, because I believed him. I believed that he had done that, and so I started, this little seed of compassion was planted, thinking, well, he did try, and he's a victim now too, because he went for help and nobody helped him. And nobody even went to our parents and said, you need to be aware that, your son is having this issue. I mean, there were so many options open at that time, and no one took any of them. And it just felt like, oh my gosh, there was a bond between us then that hadn't been there before, that he was probably abused and he was abusing me, and no one was helping us to break that cycle, right? And I knew I didn't want to pick up that cycle and abuse my own kids. And so that's what led to my ability of finally to get 10 years or 12 years later to the point where I could forgive him. I really felt that I could do that. And so I flew back home. We'd moved away, and I flew back home, and I faced him again for the first time since that incident where I read him that letter. And I said those 3 marvelous, magical words to him, was, "I forgive you." And it kind of brought all of that full circle. But another part I wasn't aware of is that, his life was really awful at that time. He had continued to commit crimes against other people. He'd been in and out of jail. He'd had a hard time holding down a job. He'd been in and out of a couple marriages that were ending in divorce. He had a couple more kids out of wedlock, and he was just trying to survive. And when I said, "I forgive you," to him, he sobbed. He literally sobbed, this, full-grown man sobbing. And it was because someone was finally giving him permission to have a different life. He was holding on to all the same guilt and shame that I'd been holding on to before then. So I knew at that point what he was feeling, and now he could release that because I was giving him permission to do that. And I was the only one who could give him permission to do that, right? Yeah. So I realized that act of forgiveness for me released everything. It really did allow me to fully heal, but it also allowed him to start to heal. No one had ever given him that option before. And so it was a big deal, and I'm glad that I was able to work through all of that and realize that my voice mattered through all of those times, whether it was breaking the silence, whether it was saying, "I forgive you." There's just been lots of words along the way that I've spoken that have had meaning, true meaning to them, that have allowed me to heal and other people to be saved and other people to be able to change their lives as well.
Well, I almost break into tears also with the story because I just felt everything that you were saying, that well, that word can be very trivial now, forgiveness, but it's so huge and
Yeah.
it releases so much power into breaking cycles, breaking toxic cycles, uh, having compassion for other people, understanding that, I mean, what you did with that letter and with that action that you had, you just open a gateway of healing for you and for him and for future generations, which is really amazing. And well, my next question is, what did you feel in the moment that you were saying I forgive you? How did you feel?
Mm.
Physically, what was the reaction that you had?
I did feel almost like a release.
Hmm.
It was, as an abuse survivor, there's so much that you just hold on to, you know, and being able to do that. And like I said, I had to buy a plane ticket. I had to travel away from my family to fly home just to do that. So it was a big deal. It was something that I knew I had to do. And it was awkward at first to see him, but then, you know, when I said those words, it was just, to me, it was like, it's done. Like in the, I don't know if you ever seen the Ten Commandments. We're kind of making an old reference to movie, but um, uh, when Christ is on the, not the Ten Commandments, but what movie is it? Where Christ is on the cross, and he says, "It is finished," and then he dies. Right? It's almost like it felt that way. As like, it is finished. It doesn't mean that I don't still have healing to do every day,
Yeah,
but those big steps in that process are now done.
yeah,
And so it was a physical release. It was good. And something else that came from the day that I read that letter to him is I made him promise that he would never hurt his daughter. And in fact, I threatened him and I said, if I ever hear that you have, I'll take her from you. I will take her from you any way I can. Right? And he promised me that he wouldn't hurt her. But we moved away. So my family knew to watch out for that, and his wife knew to watch out for that. In fact, they got divorced, and um, my niece could never spend time with her dad alone. She always had to, be with someone else when with her dad.
hmm,
And I kind of lost contact with her, but about 20 years after I forgave my brother, I mean, let me say, his life changed.
hmm, yeah,
I mean, he completely became a different person, and um, forgave himself for everything, worked through all of that himself, and just really made his life more successful in just about every area. But unfortunately, sometimes those demons can boil back up in a moment of opportunity. And so 20 years after that moment when I forgave him, he made a mistake. And in a moment of opportunity, he committed a crime
hmm,
against a child. And that child was someone that my niece knew. She
hmm,
was a child she was familiar with. And so when her dad was arrested for this, now she was probably 30 years old at the time, and
hmm,
she couldn't understand how her dad would do such a thing. And she called me. She said, my mom, I'm confused about how my dad could do something like this. And my mom said, you should talk to Aunt Jackie.
hmm,
So, Aunt Jackie, I don't know why I'm being told to call you, but what can you tell me about my dad?
hmm,
Um, and so I had an opportunity to share with her my experience
hmm,
and what her dad had been like early on.
hmm,
And she had no idea. David, she had no idea, which meant he had kept his promise.
hmm,
My brother never hurt her. And so her three little words to me that were so very powerful was, "You saved me. Aunt Jackie, you saved me." I didn't know about that for 30 years. I didn't know that what I did mattered. But again, my words when I had to break that silence and say, this is what's happened to me, that little girl is in an unsafe situation. 30 years later, she's been kept safe and realizes, I didn't understand all those things in my life where I couldn't be with my dad, but now I do. And Aunt Jackie, it's because of you that I was kept safe. So it was a great blessing because we don't always see the benefit of our actions or our words or what we do. And I was really given that tender mercy to be able to know that what I said mattered so long ago.
Yeah. Well, that was, well, not closure, of course, because as you mentioned, you keep working on those things, and as you mentioned also, your brother still have to do healing because evidently he didn't overcome everything that he had inside. So I think that the silver lining message is that we really need to pay attention of how we are feeling and everything that we have inside. And
Mm-hmm.
one thing that I had also a question or curiosity was that the question that the therapist asks you, the first thing that she faced with you is forgiveness
Yeah.
in the first interaction that you had with her. And I think that that is just I was just listening also to some research that when we look for a window of opportunity in people's mind to change,
Mm.
if there is something, if there is just a spark or a very light, very soft light of change, they can do it. They can give that jump. And I think that's what the therapist did. She looked for the most important thing, that was forgiveness. And when you told her, well, right now I don't know, but you were not neglected to, you didn't say no, never.
Yeah.
So she saw that and she pulled that from you. And I think that that's the important message. So now, what do you do with the other children, with the other people that you are helping, to see that light in them and to help them make it stronger?
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking. Yeah, I it was about 4 or 5 years ago now. I had an opportunity. I started a business, but it was a dental management business because I went into dentistry and I was a surgical assistant for a long time, and then I went into office management and I became a consultant. And so I started a business to help dentists to become more profitable. And when I started competing in the World Championship of Public Speaking, which was completely separate from my business, I started to share my abuse story a little bit.
Mm,
And I kept winning on these contest levels, and I made it to the semifinals, which means out of 33,000 competitors, I was in about the top 90.
mhm,
It was a big deal, and I was sharing this little bit of my abuse, but it was mostly about the forgiveness side of it, right? And I became a little bit of a local celebrity in my area because I was practicing my presentation to anybody who would let me come. And so I was going to all these different organizations, corporations, and at lunchtime, and sharing my speeches and then getting feedback. And in so doing, a group of homeschool parents learned about me and asked me if I would come teach their kids public speaking. They had a group of about 9 middle school kids that they had in this little co-op,
mhm.
and asked if I would come do some classes for them. And I thought, yeah, I could do that. I'd always been a little bit shy of working with kids too deeply because I always felt like I was still overcoming a lot of that inward trauma myself, and I didn't want to do any harm.
Mhm.
Not that I would abuse a kid, but I didn't want to give
Yeah.
poor advice or something like that, right? So I always sort of held myself back from getting involved too deeply with kids. But hey, I could go teach public speaking. And so I developed a curriculum for a little 9-week course. And I saw within just a couple of sessions that these 12 to 14-year-old kids were coming in, standing a little taller, faces shining brightly. They were speaking out with power. And I started to see the impact that a little bit of training had on their confidence level.
Mm.
And that's what I needed when I was their age. And no one gave that to me. And I thought, I could give this. I'm not a counselor. I don't have to deal with their abuse necessarily, but I could give them the power of their voice. I could help them with that. And so I developed more and more curriculum. And then after I taught a couple of sessions for that course, and there was a school nearby that said, we want to send you some kids and we're going to have you teach them. And then I started teaching my own courses, and I was renting any place I could, whether it was a community center or whether it was a corporate conference room, wherever I could find a table and some chairs, I would have a class for kids, and they were always selling out. They were full. And then I opened up my own public speaking studio, and kids were coming to me, and I was just seeing the amazing difference it was making for them. They were getting better grades at school. They were making better friends, and the friends were good friends. They weren't just half friends. I mean, they were really good, solid relationships. They were speaking better to their parents at home. There was better communication in the entire family. It was just changing that dynamic. They were asking better questions of their teachers so that they were learning easier. They weren't shy about that. So I saw all these added benefits to simply teaching them public speaking. Mm-hmm. And so we help kids not only with the basics of public speaking and conversation, mm-hmm. but we're getting them on stages. They're speaking on international summits, and they're giving their keynotes at in-person conferences like the National Alliance for Mental Illness conferences. They are writing books. Tomorrow, David, we're launching a book called The Parenting Owner's Manual. 8 of my students are authors of this book. Wow. They've contributed a chapter about parenting from their perspective as someone being parented, and it's a big deal. And several of my students are working on getting on the TEDx stages and giving those types of speeches. And it's marvelous to see the power that your voice can have for you, and it can open so many doors of opportunity for you. And so I am just thrilled. I never imagined that I could do something like this for kids. I didn't have to be a therapist to help them, which I didn't want to be, but I could empower their voices. Now, I don't know if the kids that I work with are abused. Mm-hmm. Statistically, they probably are. But I've never asked that question, and I give them freedom to share that information in a speech if they want to, but I've never pressured them, and we don't really talk about trauma and abuse. They know my story, so they're welcome to talk to me if they want to once they know my story, but I'm just assuming that the kids have had some sort of trauma. I know the pandemic was traumatic for all of our kids, because they were taken out of whatever was normal for them, and most of them weren't sure what the new normal was going to be, if there was ever a new normal. And so it was traumatic for them. Yeah. And I have seen that without that power of voice and confidence to speak out, a lot of kids took their own lives. And I know what that feels like, to be in a situation where you might make that choice. And so I don't have any real scientific data that says we've prevented this many kids from taking their lives, or we have stopped this amount of abuse, whatever. That's not what's important to me. What's important to me is that the kids that I do work with are getting an opportunity to speak out, and I'm thrilled to follow them into their future and see what they can do, and all the amazing opportunities they're going to have because they have this strong sense of who they are, because they're not just learning how to speak, but they're learning to be empathetic. They're learning their value system and how they know that. What are the experiences that taught them that determination is the key to success, or that honesty is the best policy, or forgiveness is a vital source of healing? Whatever it is, that's what's inside of them, and I've just helped to bring it out. So I'm delighted with what we've been able to do and the lives that we have helped. I'm excited for continued process. We have courses and we have clubs and programs for shy kids, enthusiastic, outgoing kids, whoever they are. We've got something that's going to help them to enhance who they already are. So I'm glad for that.
Well, I- mm, how would just in spite of not having track any of the scientific data, as you mentioned, or the trauma background that they could have, I dare to say that you are helping everything with giving them a channel of letting, well, first contact with their emotions, because when you contact with your emotions, you are able to speak more fluently about how you feel and what you think, and all of those things in your brain start to assemble the pieces. And I think that that is just a healing process that they are not um, conscious about, but it is happening, and you are seeing the effects.
Yeah.
So that's enough of what you are doing, of course. And I think that, well, I have always believed that all the children, including us when we were children, and including our inner child, is so in contact with a power, with a force, with
Yeah.
God, with all of those vibrations, that when we start living in the society and we start losing contact with that, and just helping them to not lose the contact with
Yeah.
that source, with that energy, with God, that is just helping them maintain their uniqueness, their
Yeah.
power, and that's how they can keep the reaction, the chain reaction of helping others to speak.
Yeah.
And what you mentioned is extremely important about the social interaction, that as we all experienced that in the 3 years that were in the pandemic, and children were the most affected, and the most affected thing what was language, because many of the children that didn't have interaction, they couldn't speak. They were 1 2 years old, 3 years old, and they didn't speak because they didn't have social interaction.
Right.
So
Well, and they watched us speak with masks on our faces, right?
yeah,
I don't think we realize how much visual
it is.
learning takes place when we're communicating face to face, right? And we see the mouth moving and the words coming out, and that we're learning something.
Yeah,
And without seeing that, you're right. So many kids could no longer speak or couldn't speak well, and it's a shame. I don't think we're gonna know the full repercussions of the pandemic for years to come, and I think we're gonna find that it's gonna be worse than we thought,
yeah. That's for sure.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jackie. And well, to summarize and to wrap things up, I think that you can help the audience with the 3 words that were most powerful for you to give the channel to your healing.
Mm. Well, they're not just one set of 3 words, but it's a journey of 3 little words, and I'll go through a few of those. So, don't tell anyone changed me.
Mhm,
I have a secret set me on a course for healing.
mhm,
Um, I forgive you
mhm,
ended the healing, or at least completed the healing process, and then you saved me was where I realized I'd made a difference. And so several little phrases of 3 little words has made a difference for me. And every one of those, you know, gave power in some way. And so I just want the audience to know, those that are listening, your words absolutely matter, and they are either poisonous or they are going to save someone. They're going to heal someone. They're going to change someone's life based on your words. And so I hope that you decide to use your words to do not to do harm, but to actually heal harm in yourself and others, because it will happen.
Thank you. Thank you, Jackie, for sharing such powerful message and, well, giving us this journey of emotions that we experienced through this talk, and all of these things that are right now are really, really important for all the people to know that we need to pay more attention to our children. We need to make them, well, to empower them to speak, to be in contact with their emotions, and to trust them in what they say. Mostly, I think trust is extremely important, because if they have our trust, they are able to do whatever we want and to do whatever they want.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we as parents, we need to be really careful the way that we communicate with our kids, because I gave you a few examples of the way my mother communicated with me, and they were not positive outcomes. And so we just have to be really careful um, what we're saying, because our kids interpret things differently,
Yeah.
and we need to have open communication with our kids. And I know that if we leave the communication open, our kids will talk to us, and they will be more willing to open up about things that are happening to them that may be traumatic, or just maybe harmful, or making them emotionally sad. And we want to be there for them as parents. We want to do that, but we have to open those lines of communication to do that.
Yeah. Thank you. And, well, I heard that you are having tomorrow a launch of this book that is
Yeah.
going to be an amazing support for many people. So I will encourage anyone that listens to this that look for the book, that look for the support that they can give to these children, to these little authors, and
Yes.
I will obviously share the information for next launch. Thank
Yes.
you
Right.
everyone for listening. Thank you, Jackie, for being here. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I think it's going to heal much more people.
I hope so. Thank you so much for letting me to use my voice today. I appreciate
Yeah,
it.
thank you. Bye.